Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending our third annual Sandra Bland event. Um, this is just a very special project for us, and we're so glad that you're able to join us once again. We have sorors, looks like from all regions. So thank you for coming out and sharing this event with us. It is an honor to have you. It's an honor to have soror Deirdre Cooper Owens here with this presentation. And with that, I'm going to leave it to soror Dr. Malika Brown.
Thank you so much, Basilis Walker. I am honored to be here another year for our programming that we started back in 2020 in honor of our fallen soror, Sandra Bland. The first year, we actually did a watch party. It was when her documentary was released, and we watched that together. Kind of was cathartic for a lot of us because there's still so many unanswered questions. There's so many things that have not been rectified when it comes to her case. So we were able to look at the documentary that her family had a large part in putting together and kind of talk through what we were feeling about her life and it being lost. And with her birthday being yesterday, we tried to have this event as close to her birthday as possible. And we know that this time of the year can be kind of tricky with a lot of different events, but we've been pretty good about having it as close to her birthday as possible. The second year, we tackled the issue of human trafficking. And so we partnered with the University of Southern California. We were able to get together, do some group work, and actually problem solve on some tangibles that we could take back to our respective communities in order to address the issue of human trafficking. And this year, we are looking at the issue of reproductive autonomy. And with the overturning of Roe versus Wade after 50 years last June by the US Supreme Court, we know that this is something that we need to discuss. It's important, even if it's not something that matters directly to you. The fact that women now do not have a say so in their reproductive processes is against our constitutional rights. And so we are going to be talking about the history of this issue. I believe we have an amazing, amazing woman who will be able to educate us on the history of this issue in our country. And we will have opening for questions at the end of her presentation. So I would like to do a presenting of our speaker for this evening. Deirdre Cooper Owens is the Linda and Charles Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and Director of Humanities in Medicine program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, one of two Black women in the nation who holds these positions. Dr. Cooper Owens also serves as Director of the Program in African American History at the Library Company of Philadelphia. She is an Organization of American Historians, OAH, Distinguished Lecturer, a past American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Research Fellow, and has won several prestigious honors and awards for her scholarly and advocacy work in history and reproductive and birthing justice. Most recently, the University of Virginia School of Nursing selected Dr. Cooper Owens as the 2022 Agnes Dillon Randolph Award winner for her scholarship on the history of Black nurses and healers, their highest honor. A popular public speaker and writer, Dr. Cooper Owens has published articles, essays, book chapters, and op eds on issues that concern African American historical experiences and reproductive justice. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won a Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. It has recently been translated into Korean and will be translated into Brazilian Portuguese in winter of 2022. She is currently working on a popular biography of Harriet Tubman's Examining Here through the lens of disability and a monograph about the history of race, medical discovery, and the C-section. And I am proud to say that she is a 30-year member of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated and also my soror. Welcome to the virtual stage, Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens.
Hello, it is my great pleasure to be able to join you tonight. I'm in Central Standard Time. And so I just want to extend my greetings to Theta Epsilon Sigma chapter for inviting me. I could not say no. The Basilisk is my line sister from 30 years ago. I joked with Soror Brown that I was 10 when I went over and she was 25. So we're going to stay with that. But I thank all of you for coming. And also, I try to keep my presentations lighthearted in some ways, but this is a really important topic. It can be heavy at times. And in particular, here we are remembering and honoring the life and legacy of a fallen soror, a fallen sister, a Black woman who should still be here. And so I say this also with the deepest respect to Sandra Bland's memory. So with that, I'm going to start the slide, and I'm trying to figure out how to bring this. Okay, now you can see the slide. So I am, oops, let's see here. All right, so this is what I do. I'm a historian. I often joke, I write about dead people. And oftentimes I would wonder, why in the world are people interested in learning about the 19th century? And I remember saying this to a group of public health officials and doctors and nurses when I was in Chicago giving a talk. And they said quite earnestly, we had never learned, we'd never heard of this. We didn't know that there was a connection between slavery and the rise of American gynecology. And this was in the midst, I mean, we're still in it, we're still mired in it, but in the midst of the kind of mainstream audience learning about the Black birthing crisis. And so I hope tonight in our conversation after my presentation that we can really talk about the structural ways to dismantle the Black birthing crisis. So this is why history matters. So let me start off with a quotation by a doctor, Dr. Ed Livingston. You can see his picture here. He was the former deputy editor of the journal that's published by the American Medical Association. And it was to be a podcast that was dedicated to trying to understand medical racism. So its intention, right, seems good. It seems honorable. Hey, here are medical professionals understanding that this country is facing a dire birthing crisis that disproportionately impacts Black women and birthing people and their children. And so this is how Dr. Livingston and his guest start out, right? He sends out a tweet that no physician is racist, so how can there be structural racism in healthcare? Well, that seems to totally go against, right? That stands in opposition of the podcast issue, right? This theme. So Dr. Livingston then says, structural racism is an unfortunate term. Personally, I think taking racism out of the conversation will help. Many people like myself are offended by the implication that we are somehow racist. So here was Dr. Livingston putting his feelings, right, as a white male physician above the actual racism that's been documented, that's been substantiated by study after study after study, right, than Black women and birthing people. And so this is really where we're starting. And so what I need to do, right, when I go into these places is tell them that the kind of medical racism that we're talking about is not something that comes from centuries ago, but the statistics show that medical practitioners are holding these views today, right? And let me be very clear, white medical practitioners are holding these views. And I'm not saying this in a hyperbolic way. I'm not playing some proverbial race card. I've been Black for 50 years. I still haven't seen the race cards that people have been talking about, right? Nobody's given me a deck yet. But I'm saying this because the stats show this. And the people who are coming up with statistics often don't look like me. These are white people who are saying, hey, let's understand where these views are coming from. And so one of the more famous studies that made a huge splash in 2016 was one conducted by Kelly Hoffman. She's now a doctor. At the time, she was a doctoral student at the University of Virginia. And she conducts this study in 2014. And it's a study that is to assess pain perceptions amongst white medical practitioners with white patients and Black patients. And so one would think, okay, this is the 21st century. In fact, this is a study that's less than 10 years old. Surely these medical residents, would not hold views that are antithetical to science, but also harmful to patients. But guess what her research reveals? A substantial number of white lay people, medical students, and residents hold false beliefs about biological differences between Black people and white people. So this is the thing. I'm a historian. And so what that means is I fall in the humanities and also the social sciences. For as long as I've been teaching undergrads, right? And I got my PhD from UCLA. So I've been teaching undergrads since the early 2000s. I've never run across a book that said Black people and white people are biologically different. This is the thing. If a white person needed a heart transplant and I was a match, right? Blood type, all of those things, that person's body didn't reject it, I could donate my heart to that patient. What science has taught us for a very long time, human beings are more alike than we are different, which is why different people can produce children, all of these kinds of things. So these kinds of fictions that somehow there are these biological differences. Her study also found their beliefs predict racial bias in pain perception and treatment recommendation accuracy, right? And so let me just stop here. I'm going to put a pin in that because you can read the other bullet points. But this is the thing that's really interesting. She surveys almost 300 medical residents. Now, for anyone who isn't a doctor, now I'm a PhD, I'm not an MD, but I know enough about it, right? I've done enough consultations with doctors, nurses, all kinds of professionals in the medical industry to know that when you are a resident, that means you've already had your white coat ceremony, you've already taken the Hippocratic Oath, and you are coming in, completing med school. You're now going into the practicum part of your work. But beyond that, you've entered into med school with a BA or a BS, right? So that means you have 4 years of schooling. These are highly educated people. They're coming in with 4-year degrees. They are entering into one of the country's most respected, highly ranked medical programs. UVA is a school, and I have experience with it. That's where I did my postdoctoral fellowship after I left UCLA. UVA is a school that is so elite. The only reason it's not an Ivy is because William and Mary in Virginia was found before UVA. That's the only reason, right? So people remind you all the time just how lucky you are to get there, how competitive it is. I was reminded every day I was at UVA just how fortunate I was. So these are supposed to be the creme de la creme. And yet what Kelly Hoffman and her team found was quite surprising even for me. They found that these medical residents, over 63% of them believed Black people had thicker skin, Black people aged faster, Black people didn't experience pain. If they did complain about pain, it was because they wanted narcotics or drugs. They were being histrionic. Two of the medical residents actually believed that Black people were born with tails. I wish I could make this up. And this was the thing. With her study, she literally creates twin scenarios, except one patient is white in this fictive case, and then the other patient is Black. So one of them surrounded pain perception and kidney stones. I would hope none of us had kidney stones. My husband just went through his second bout this year. It's extremely painful, right? I mean, this was a man, big, tall, very white voice, sounds like James Earl Jones, who was reduced to tears. It's so painful, right? You can barely walk, you can barely talk. And also the other was childbirth. Now, I don't have children, but I know people who've had children. I hear childbirth is not necessarily a walk in the park, right? But there is pain involved in that process. And so the belief by these residents, Black people aren't really experiencing this pain. So where in the world does this come from? And how does someone like the guy, Dr. Livingston in the previous slide, how does he make this presumption that structural racism doesn't exist? But we're finding in 2014 that in fact, right, it does exist. So I then point people, because, I'm a historian. I'm supposed to provide the historical pieces to the puzzle. Well, where did these beliefs come from? Because they're not getting them from people like me. They're not getting it from their science books. They're not getting it from their textbooks written by people in the social sciences and the humanities. So where in the world are these students, right? These residents, where are they getting it from? Yeah, it could be their families, but most people don't have family members who are scientists. So what this means is there's a willful embrace of anti-Blackness that's going on. And that's really scary because you've already taken an oath to do no harm, which is a part of the Hippocratic oath. So a lot of this can be traced back to the colonial period, to the 19th century period. And so who I like to focus on, and I'll just kind of point to my left from what I'm seeing on my screen, Dr. Samuel Cartwright is someone who's really interesting because some of the things he's written about Black people and white people in the antebellum era, so that means the 1800s, the 19th century, what he wrote about literally mirrors some of the beliefs that these 21st century medical residents had at one of the top ranked medical universities in the country, right? So Sam Cartwright was asked by the Louisiana State Medical Association to publish an article on the distinctive diseases and characteristics of the Negro and the white man, right? To use the language of the time. And he agrees to do so. So he goes off and he publishes an article based on medical research. And he looks at two groups of people. He looks at the Negro race. And this is the thing, all of his Negro subjects were enslaved. And he looks at white people. And he comes up, right, based on his research with a number of findings. He finds that Black people have a propensity to so-called eat clay or dirt. They're dirt eaters. That Black people have thicker skin, that Black people have a tendency to be sassy, so a disease called rascality. The most famous of them, and today we would say infamous, he believed that Black people suffered from a mental condition called drapetomania. And drapetomania meant that if an enslaved person harbored the thought of running away or ran away, it was a mental illness because slavery was the natural state of the Negro. Now, why in the world would the Louisiana State Medical Association ask Sam Cartwright to come up with this article? Well, there had already been political factions brewing between the North and the South. And the South needed to maintain and preserve slavery because it made the South during the antebellum era the fourth richest nation in the world, right? Not even counting the North and the Industrial Revolution that's taking place there. The South, because of cotton production, is the fourth richest economy in the world. And so there has to be not just a political justification for the slavery of Black people or economic, well, there has to be some biological justification. And so they ask a prominent medical researcher and doctor and surgeon to conduct this research. Now, a couple of years later, by the 1850s, Dr. Cartwright has done more research on Black and white people with the spirometer. So if you look to my right, where I'm pointing with my hand here, you'll see a book called Breathing into the Machine. Those are images of the 19th century spirometer. Many of us have come into contact with it. If you've ever breathed into a machine that assesses your lung capacity, that's a spirometer. What in the world does this have to do with reproductive justice, right? I'll explain. So Cartwright does this research between the Negro and the white man, and he finds that in fact, Black people do have a lessened lung capacity, which means, right, further proof that they're biologically inferior. Now, what he doesn't explain is all of these people are enslaved, and if you have ever visited a plantation, especially in the former slaveholding South, and you see some of those plantations, slave cabins, they're small, they're not well insulated, they're not well ventilated. You have family members, oftentimes many of them, sometimes upwards 5, 6, 7, 8 people living in a small cabin. Sometimes there are windows, sometimes there aren't, and a big chimney or fireplace in the middle of the room. So you're taking in that smoke. Well, if I live like that as well, I might have a lessened lung capacity. But let me tell you, he's not the first person who comes up with this, right? Folk have been saying this well before, in the century before. A man, Benjamin Rush, known as the father of American medicine, stated that Black people had less in lung capacity. Thomas Jefferson writes about this in his book in 1804. So from the 18th century, 19th century, people are stating this about Black folk and not taking into account that slavery is what's the cause of this, right? Slavery disables you, right? Slavery does not level the playing field in any way. So slavery has, goo gods of people living in one unventilated and one unventilated and insulated space. So this is interesting, right? This is really interesting because what happens, you take that research, and by the time of the Civil War, right, when the Union or the U.S. government is interested in trying to figure out if Black men should be soldiers to fight for the Union cause, they're using machines like the spirometer to assess whether the Black man is fit for service. This goes into the 20th century and the 21st century, where today, if we breathe into the machine, what happens is, if a white person and a Black person have the same reading or numbers after breathing into the spirometer, you are supposed to adjust the dial for a Black person, even though the reading might be the same. How does this filter down for the Black community? What this means is, for insurance companies and policies, sometimes we charge more because of pre-existing conditions. And it's not just, right, the spirometer. This happens with kidney disease and the reading of functions with that are adjusted for Black people. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So the context behind medical racism is not just about one person, but there have been building blocks already in place, right, that help to create an environment for these kinds of racial fictions to grow and to become further validated. So a part of my job as a historian is to really provide this context. But that's really hard whenever you're dealing with folk who kind of catch wind. Oh, wait, there's this political issue brewing, or there's a societal issue brewing. How do we make sense of that? And so the thing that sells newspapers, as many of you know, I was a journalism major, a mass comm major in undergrad, is you have to have a scintillating byline, right? You have to have something that draws people in. And so typically the way that happens is you position things as either or, right? So for instance, this is an article that was published a few years back in South Carolina Post and Courier about Dr. James Marion Sims. He's the doctor who was known as the father of gynecology, of American gynecology. And almost every article that talked about Sims talked about this father of American gynecology as either exceptionally brutal, or perhaps he was a savior of women because of the surgical technique that he came up with. And I'm saying to the editor, this is the wrong way to pitch it, because if we focus solely on Sims, we lose sight that we're talking about a structural or systemic issue, right? And so from my vantage point, both and can exist. Either or is too limiting. And so I like to show people why that happens, right? So this comes about because of protests that took place in New York in 2017. And a group of Black women, you can see them in this slide, a group of Black women who had righteous intentions, right? They were angry, and they were building on the work of grassroots organizations that wanted the Sims statue removed from Central Park. Just so happens in 2017, I was teaching at Queens College in New York, living in New York, and my book was just about to come out. So all of a sudden, everybody's saying to me, what do you think about the Sims statue? Should it be removed? And literally, I said, I don't live in East Harlem. I live in Brooklyn. I'm not saying that these issues are not important. However, what was more important for me was to be able to help folk understand the antebellum world, and that Sims was not exceptional in his abuse. Sims was a slave-owning physician, and he did what other slave-owning physicians did at the time. And this is not me defending him, but to be able to say, most of us get our information about the slave past from movies. And movies are meant to entertain, not necessarily educate, right? And so a part of what I wanted to do is to show he wasn't that exceptional, right? At all. Not at all. And so Sims he's literally inheriting a practice of medical racism, scientific racism against Black people, against Black women, against women that had already existed. And so I often go back to a French-born natural historian, that's just an old school term for a scientist, a research scientist, a man named Georges Cuvier. And Cuvier was arguably the most famous research scientist who lived in the Western world. And this was in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And he starts to run a research lab, and he is also over the menagerie at the National Museum of Paris. And what that means is he heads up the division of plants and animals. So he gets in his contact a South African-born woman named Saartjie Baartman, who was known as the Hottentot Venus, a very derisive name for this African-born woman. And largely because Hottentot was a racial epithet that Europeans used against South Africans. But beyond that, she becomes really interesting to Europeans, largely because of the size of her buttocks, right? Now, this becomes interesting for me as a historian of medicine and Black women in particular in slavery, because I'm thinking, wait, what was so interesting about her buttocks? Well, these medical and scientific men look at the size of her buttocks, and instead of just saying she has a big butt, all of a sudden, the size of her buttocks, are enlarged, and so they are so atypical. It's now a pathological condition known as steatopegia. Oh, I think the slide went away. Okay, steatopegia, right? And people are still, to this day, right, in the medical profession, using that term as if enlarged buttocks means that you have some pathological condition. Furthermore, Saartjie Baartman was seen by Cuvier as someone who might have existed between the human and the primate world, right? So is this woman, right, really the missing link between humans and apes? He wants to see. Well, it is unfortunate that he has the opportunity to see, because Saartjie Baartman dies at the age of 25, right? She lived a horrible short life, right? She was exploited, used by her owners, in Africa, in Europe. She becomes an oddity, a kind of object of curiosity for a white Western population. In fact, the bustle, those old dresses that we see in the late 18th century, early 19th century with white women who would have the dresses that kind of elevated the size of their buttocks, that was based on Saartjie Baartman's physique. She was forced into sex work. She developed an overdependency on alcohol, developed sexually transmitted diseases, and dies at 25. So just a horribly tough life. Once Cuvier has essentially control of her dead body, he examines her cadaver, cuts out her brain, preserves it, puts it in a bell jar, finds that she has a normal human brain, cuts out her genitalia, preserves it, puts it in a bell jar, right? She doesn't, in fact, have the hooded Hottentot labia that he thought she would, right? And then, most importantly, you can see her skeletal frame here. He cleans her bones, removes her tendons and everything, her organs, finds she's, in fact, a regular human being. There's nothing odd about Baartman at all. Now, if one would think, okay, this is the end of it. No. There are even lessons in the afterlife of slavery for Cuvier and the people who then learned from him. All of these things are placed on display in the museum. She's written about even after death. And what we start to see across the pond, right, in the United States, is all of a sudden folk are writing about the movement of dead body parts, of organs that they're sending to schools and colleges and museums, right? Physicians' personal collections. There's even a value in the afterlife, the body and the remains of enslaved people, so that medical practitioners can learn from them. So once again, right, we start to see Sims is not that exceptional. He's borrowing from ideas and practices that already exist. The next person who most folk have not heard about is a guy, Ephraim McDowell, father of the ovariotomy. And Ephraim McDowell, slave-owning physician, born in Virginia, family moves out west. Back then, out west was Kentucky. And he is interested in becoming a doctor, does so, and what he does is performs the first successful abdominal-based operation recorded in the Western world. And he does so initially on a white woman. In fact, here I am. I'm someone who has benefited from that. I just had surgery two Fridays ago, right? So he does this thing, and then he figures, hey, you know what? I want to be able to see if there's a particular practice, right, or method I can use to teach other surgeons how to remove these ovarian tumors and save the patient so the patient doesn't bleed out. This is unheard of. This happens in 1809. So in Kentucky, he gathers 5 negresses, as he called them. So 5 Black women, 4 of them were enslaved. 1 was a free woman of color. And he performs these experimental surgeries over a span of 8 years. 1 of them dies. Now, I'm sitting here because I'm married to a Black man from West Virginia. There are not many Black people in Appalachia, as we know. So I'm sitting here thinking, how in the world did this man find 5 Black women who are all suffering from ovarian, suspected ovarian conditions? There were no X-ray machines for him to utilize. So how is he going to these women and trying to figure out, like, how does he assess whether they're suffering from ovarian tumors or not? But he does, right? According to his notes. 1817 publishes an article. One would think, okay, he's about to change the game. The United States is about to go on the map. It doesn't. It doesn't. And this is the really interesting part. Publishes this article. Surgeons and physicians from all over the Western world, England, United States, other nations, they deride him. Why? They say, well, of course you could use these negresses. They bear cutting with the impunity of dogs and rabbits, meaning they don't experience pain and they reproduce really fast. So when we have these ideas that only one person came up with this idea, no, people have believed that Black women didn't experience pain centuries ago. Right? So that's Ephraim McDowell. The next person, most folk have not heard of him. This is the person I really think we need to pay attention to, which is why I'm writing a book on him as well. Dr. Francois-Marie Prévost, French born. He graduates in 1799 from a medical school, reputable medical school in France, moves to a very rich French colony, Haiti, in 1799. What does he do in Haiti as a doctor? Because he's not a planter, doesn't own a plantation. He experiments on enslaved women, trying to perfect the C-section. But the Haitian Revolution is about to break out, so he leaves. He goes to another former French colony, now a part of the United States. You guessed it, Louisiana. Now, this historical marker has wrong information. That's the thing. Oftentimes when we read these historical markers, we think they're 100% accurate. They aren't. They are not. He's not the first person in the US to have done a successful C-section. He's the second, and it was actually in 1831. But Prévost practices this on 2 enslaved women, even naming one of the women's babies after him, right? So when people talk about this whole matriarchal culture, I was like, matriarchs and patriarchs have power. How in the world does an enslaved woman have power when she can't even name her baby or deliver in the way that she wants to? But that's a different conversation, right? So what he does, he experiments on these enslaved women. Now, this is the thing that we really need to be talking about. Louisiana, until 2 or 3 years ago, I promise you, from the time of 1831 until the 21st century, remains the #1 state for the disproportionate use of Black women and birthing people with regard to C-sections. I mean, the line remained unbroken. The only state that knocked it down to #2 was Mississippi, which has the most populous Black population of all states, right? Withstanding Washington, D.C., which is a district and not a state. This is still going on, right? And nobody's questioning why these Black bodies are being used for surgeries that many of them don't need. Many of you who've had C-sections and you're wondering, why don't I feel the same? Why do I experience this swelling and this bloating in my stomach? It can't seem to go down no matter what I do. It's because doctors know how to take the baby out. They don't know how to put your intestines and other organs back in, sometimes stuffing them in. This is why you're suffering this pain, right? So these are the legacies and the retentions. And this is still ongoing. Someone else, John Peter Matara, I mean, I could go on and on, got a whole first chapter dedicated to this, right? Pioneer in the surgery that everybody attributes to James Marion Sims. This man did it almost 10 years before, using experimental surgeries on a Black woman and a white woman. Black woman is enslaved. He takes silk sutures or silk thread. He closes the holes or the fistula of the white woman. Now, how does one get an obstetrical fistula or vesical vaginal fistula? You get it from a very prolonged or protracted pregnancy, meaning your delivery would last anywhere from 2, 3, 4 days. By this point, the baby is typically dead, so it's born stillborn. Some cases alive, but 9 times out of 10, it's born. It's a stillborn baby. So these young women are experimented on by Matara. The white woman is literally saved. She's quote unquote cured. The enslaved woman is not. He writes in his article that he tries this 8 different times. And in a fit of frustration, but for me as a historian, deep truth, he writes, he says, the patient, meaning this enslaved woman, she could have been cured if she stopped engaging in sexual intercourse. Now, sir, you're a whole surgeon and physician. You're also a whole slave owner. You know good and well that enslaved women don't own their bodies, that enslaved women were the most vulnerable of women in American society. How in the world could she have stopped you from experimenting on her body 8 different times? She certainly might not have been able to stop any form of sexual intercourse, right? And so this practice of the patient blaming, here we see this in these earlier medical journal articles, in these case notes. If there's a negative medical outcome, it's the patient's fault, it's the Black person's fault. How many times have we heard, oh, Black women suffer these pregnancy complications because they're too fat? Often joke, Black people we didn't invent Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's. We didn't even invent Popeyes, right? So if the average American woman wears a size 14, how is it that only fat Black women are at fault, right? These are the kinds of legacies of this medical racism that we're having to contend with. And then lastly, the guy who everybody wants to know about, James Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology. I get asked about him so much. I just came back from South Carolina yesterday after giving a talk, right? And everybody, they all want to know about him. And I'm sitting here like, he wasn't as exceptional as you all are making. In fact, he wasn't called the father of American gynecology until after he dies. But this is what people have, they've gotten some things right, but a lot wrong on him, right? And I've heard everybody from D.L. Hughley talk about him. I've heard, all of these folk write, these articles, there are all these, things on Twitter and documentaries and this and that. And I'm saying, why don't we ask some of the historians? Why don't we look at some of his notes, right? It could tell us a lot. Let's read his memoir and see what he actually says, right? Now, this is what I've heard, right, about this guy. I've heard things that say, well, he was so compassionate and He treated the enslaved patients and women that he worked on, that he experimented on so well. He took them in at his own cost into his home, even having a hospital built for him. And he cured them of a deadly condition. And I'm saying, there's some things that you get, some things are right factually, a lot is wrong, right? Number one, this man was no more compassionate than, I mean, what's slave owners' compassion? If they're compassionate, you free it, right? You free these people and you farm your own land, or you pay people to farm your land. But he doesn't do that, right? What he does is he enters into a business agreement like most property owners did in the 19th century. He enters into a business agreement with the owners of these sick women. And he says, hey, which is standard practice, hey, if you loan me these women, i.e. chattel or movable property, I can take on the cost of caring for them and also try to heal them. Because this is the thing, he needs experience. This is a population where you don't have to ask the patient, they're enslaved, they don't have rights. They're not even considered human beings legally, they're considered property. So you lease them, and that's what he does, you lease them with the hopes that you can repair what ails their body, right? But in order to do that, you have to experiment on them. And this is the other thing, you don't know how long the experiments will last. So that's what he does. This had nothing to do with his own personal love or care for these women. It was a standard business practice. Two of the most famous formerly enslaved people that we know about, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, were leased in childhood. Harriet Tubman was 6 years old when she was first leased. So the same way we lease cars, we even lease clothes, rent the runway, all of those kinds of places. We lease apartments. That's not a new practice. The other thing on the other side is, oh my God, he intentionally mangled and butchered the body parts of these Black women. I was like, wait, put a pin in it. He's the slave-owning physician. The very engine that maintains and preserves the system of slavery, according to the laws that these white legislators and men in power created, was that slavery was a condition that was passed on from the pregnant enslaved woman to her child. They literally made a law because so many white men were raping Black women, and the Black women were saying, well, wait, my child can't be enslaved if the father is white. So in the colonial period, they got rid of that. They didn't care who the father was. You could be Thomas Jefferson, who had enslaved children. You could be James Madison, who had enslaved children. I mean, I could go on and on. You could be any powerful white man, right, who owned slaves and had enslaved children. And they would never have access to your inheritance, your status, your condition. But if the mother was enslaved, these colonial lawmakers and later American lawmakers said, okay, the way that we perpetuate slavery, since the slave trade is now abolished as of 1817, boom, put it on the mother. Once again, that goes back to what kind of power is that when people talk about matriarchal societies? That's not a matriarchal society. That's a matrifocal one, meaning the focus is on the mother, but not by her own doing. And that does not mean that the mother didn't love their child, but none of the own doing. That's because of the laws that have been legislated that essentially free these fathers, right, these white men, from having to acknowledge their children legally. So why would a slave-owning physician and surgeon mangle the body parts of enslaved people that he's leasing? So he doesn't even own them outright. But also, you want to fix their reproductive conditions so that the system can continue. Remember, slavery makes this country extremely rich, not just the South. It makes the nation a really wealthy nation in a short period of time. So that's kind of out the window. Then there's this whole thing, well, he intentionally drugs them because there's evidence, and he writes about it, that he gives them opiates. Well, guess what I was given? I was given an opiate too when I had surgery. Because guess what opiates do? They relieve you of pain. So you get that afterwards, it's not before, but it relieves you of pain, but it also creates constipation. If one is suturing a fistula or a hole, because with this condition, right, women who have these prolonged pregnancies, when you're trying to push this baby out, there's all of this friction that happens. This is the upper vaginal area fistula, holes are formed. What's above the upper vaginal area right here? The bladder. Incontinence is the result. If there's tearing in the anus, incontinence is the result there. So the one thing you don't want to happen to break those sutures or that stitching is a bowel movement. So you give the patient opiates. That was practiced for a millennia. People have been using that, right? Once again, that's not intentional. That's a standard medical practice of the 19th century, right? And they're doing it not because of race. They're doing it for everybody. The first opioid crisis that this nation faces is with white Civil War soldiers because doctors had been giving them opiates. So this is something that had just been standard practice, right? So there are all of these ways. Oh, and the biggest one is, well, he experimented on them and did not ask their permission. He didn't use anesthesia. Why in the world would a slave owner ask the permission of an enslaved person? Slavery doesn't work that way. It is forced labor. Do you really think an enslaved owner is going to go to an enslaved person and say, hey, Betsy, can I operate on you today? Can you let me? Can you, I mean, if somebody came to you and said, do you want to, can I own you? You don't ask that question. You take people by force, right? So that in the 19th century, asking someone who's not even considered a legal human being makes no sense. I couldn't write a book if I made that as my thesis or my argument. It wouldn't get published. And this whole, he didn't use anesthesia. Name a 19th century doctor that used anesthesia in the 1840s on a regular basis. Yes, it existed. Anesthesiology, though, as a medical branch did not exist. And so you can't use something that you don't know, you don't have knowledge about. And most people who used it tended to be dentists, and they used it on themselves to experiment. So once again, right, you can't put this 21st century lens trying to extract logic or even answers for a 19th century world, like I said, that most people don't know about, because most of what we've learned have been from TV and movies that unfortunately get so much wrong. So what do we really know, right? What we know is this man leased these women. We only, and there are about 6 to 9 of them. We're not quite sure the full number. We only know the names of 3 of them, Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy. And we know that he experimented on them over a number of years. He failed miserably the first couple of years. In fact, failed so deeply and badly that his 2 white male surgical assistants quit. So he did what Sims did, what any other slave-owning surgeon would do. He trained the very Black women that he experimented on with his patients to serve as nurses and as surgical assistants. And I often say, tongue planted firmly in cheek. That's when he finally got it right. Now, this is where all of the hypocrisies, what I tend to call the racial cognitive dissonance, comes up, right? All of a sudden, Sims, who believe, is writing all of this really anti-Black, anti-woman stuff, is going against the very thing he writes. Oh, Black people don't experience pain, huh? Then why in the world do you have to restrain them? Because this is the thing. If I don't experience pain, I don't even know what pain is. You don't have to restrain me to cut me open, because I'm not going to feel it. But yet, every operation, they're restrained. Oh, these people are on the intellectual level of animals and children. Then why would you teach them the same surgical techniques that you did those white men who were literate? These are a group of illiterate Black women, because slavery would crumble if the workers were actually dumb, didn't know how to do anything well, were stupid. The institution wouldn't have made the country the richest in the nation if you were dependent upon a group of people who needed you at every turn. You were dependent on them. They weren't dependent upon you, right? And then women. Oh, women are logical. Women think with their uteri, not their brains, because they have too many nerves, right, to think clearly. And yet, here this group of illiterate Black women who were enslaved, right? They're the winning surgical team, right? Who help you to create this reparative surgery. So where that leaves us, right, is with some of the historical fictions that I've had to correct. Where did all of this happen? So when I say that the quote unquote father of American gynecology, right, starts this in the slaveholding South and not in New York, as had been attributed to him, I'm going by what he wrote. So if you look at these pictures, right, you'll see a picture of his home in Alabama and the hospital that he says he built for these enslaved women in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, why is this so important? Because the marker in New York says the first hospital dedicated to women's diseases is the New York State Hospital for Women, founded by James Marion Sims in 1855. These experimental surgeries performed in that very hospital that you see to my right, formed in the 1840s in Montgomery, Alabama. The structure is still standing to this day. How in the world do we not accept what he wrote and these images that exist, right, of his home, of his hospital? Oh, because those are Black people, so somehow they don't matter. That hospital doesn't matter. Only the one in New York that he founded in the 1850s matter. And I'm saying, no. We can't discount what this man wrote, right? We have to present accurate information. The other thing that people still to this day, right, and when I say people, medical practitioners use, the Sims speculum. If you've ever had a pap smear, that bivalve that allows the nurse or the physician, right, or the PA to get a clearer view of your cervix, it has everything to do with slavery. Now, he didn't invent the speculum. Speculums already existed. But what he does is he takes 2 pewter spoons, because this is the thing, in the 19th century, doctors, right, the male doctors are not supposed to touch women. I know it sounds weird, but you can look at these. If you Google images, you'll see doctors with their eyes closed trying to examine a woman up underneath those hoop skirts like this, right? So, but Black women are supposed to be, right? They have no modesty. They're immodest. He had them naked on the table, and he says, oh, well, I can see this fistula, this hole that, that creates the incontinence if I'm able to see better. So he takes 2 pewter spoons, gets the idea, well, if I can, as he writes, see as no man has seen before, see that cervix and fistula as clear as the nose on my face, hey, let me go on and get this speculum redesigned. So he creates the speculum. And that's what literally creates in fact, the Sims speculum is used today, but also that kind of bivalve speculum, right? That has literal origins in the history of slavery. The position that people use for the fistula or operation, typically called the lithotomy, no, he names it the Sims position. Now, this is a really important thing. In Sims's articles, he writes that he was working on enslaved women. Guess what we see, though, when the illustrations come out? White woman, white nurse, she's clothed. And Sims isn't even holding the tools, the white nurse is. And I'm sitting here like, wait, you worked on Black women and Black patients. And they were butt naked. All of a sudden, these people are clothed. It doesn't look like it's painful at all. There's no blood. There's no nothing. You just see these neat drawings. And so when I started my research as a UCLA student, and I'm going and calling these archives, and I'm gung-ho, I'm going to tell this history, they're telling me, guess what? You don't have enough to even write a pamphlet. You need to go on and focus on the Civil War. And then I'm told by these archivists, this is just 2006, 2007. My soror Brooke, who's the bastard, she can tell you. She knows. We were there in LA at the same time. And they would tell me, oh, these people didn't leave any written. I said, well, how can the people who were not allowed to read and write leave written sources? But what I do know is I know how to read and write, right? I know how to read and write, and I know how to read between the lines. That's what's called, right, the feminist methodology, Black feminist methodology, the practice of reading what isn't there. So literally, I read between the lines and I started to say, oh, let me tell you why you don't think that there was a literal connection between slavery and this branch of medicine. Because when you look at the illustrations, when you look at the pictures, we're not even there. But the words say that we were, right? I don't have to make this up. So now where does that leave us in the 21st century? I wish I could say it left us in a better place. I say this without hyperbole. I wish I could say I could change the narrative. There was a more concerted effort to save Black women's pregnancies in slavery than freedom, because there was a literal price tag on the heads of Black children. Freedom comes all of a sudden. We talk about baby mamas who are sexually irresponsible, crack mamas. We're talking about welfare queens. Wait, Y'all were giving free blankets and ration or food for enslaved women who were having twins, who were having a number of babies. But wait, all of a sudden, when Black women are having babies in freedom, that's a financial burden on society because there's no longer a price tag on their head. So where that leaves us is the United States is the most dangerous high income earning nation in the world for Black people to be pregnant and give birth. Nationally, 3 to 4 times more likely to experience pregnancy complications and die than white women. When I lived in Brooklyn, New York, when my book came out in 2017, that number for Brooklyn, New York was 8 times more than white women. I now live in Lincoln, Nebraska. Lincoln, Nebraska has single-digit Black populations. Omaha, which is less than an hour away, has about 12, 13% Black, but maybe 14% on a good day. The numbers still rival at 3 to 4 times more likely. In places where Black people don't even live, the numbers still rival the national average. That's the legacy that we're talking about. There are still people who believe that Black folk don't experience pain when they're giving birth. But I used to end on this kind of sad note, but I said, no, because there are often these narratives that, what, Black people ain't doing. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. I know. I meet them. I consult. I mean, look at Michelle Browder, Black woman from Montgomery, Alabama. And she reclaims the legacy. She grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, didn't know anything about James Marion Sims or Anarcha Betsy Lucy. Learned about them when she went away to college in Atlanta. And so she decided on her family's land, I'm going to build a memorial to these Black women, the mothers of gynecology. Not only did Michelle Browder do this, and she's in fact having her 2nd annual Mothers of Gynecology conference. Not only did she do this in memory of them, she also, get this, bought the hospital where Sims performed those excruciating experimental surgeries. Now a Black woman from Montgomery, Alabama owns the hospital that Sims did those experiments on. And she will use it as a memorial to them. It will become a clinic and a teaching space, right? So that Black women and their children can be saved. Kimberly Seals Allers, she's the founder of Earth App and Black Breastfeeding Week. For any of you who've ever heard of this, right? Kimberly is out here, killing the game, so to speak, right? And so she was like, wait, where's the data tracking? Why don't we know enough about this? You can go on your Android, any Android store, or you can go to your Apple store and literally download it. She said, hey, sis, I'm leaving the B off because that's for bias and that's what we don't want. So if any of you are now expecting, go to this Earth app and you download it. And what I want you to do is you put in your experiences so that we now have a database controlled by Black and brown bodies, right? To say, you know what, this doctor, this nurse, this lactation specialist, they're amazing. Or you know what, y'all, don't go here. If you want to save your life and that of your child, don't you go here. That's what the Earth app does. Black Breastfeeding Week, right? Reclaiming the legacy. And what is really important for me, right? Because I love to start with the stats, right? So I start off with the little stats, but I like to end with the big ones. Rachel Hardiman, Black woman who's a public health scholar, University of Minnesota. After conducting research for almost 2 million hospital records, in the state of Florida, looking at births of Black women, Black birthing people and their children, she found in 1.8 million of those records from 1992, so the late 20th century, all the way to 2015, the 21st century, that when Black mothers birthing people had Black providers, mortality, morbidity rate cut by over 50%. When those babies were born and they had Black providers, mortality, morbidity rates cut by over 50%. So when we say that it is not race, but it's racism. That's not us, once again, playing this imaginary deck of the race cards that I've never been given. If y'all got it, please send it to me. I'll give you my address in the chat, right? Because I've never seen it. That's not us playing a race card. That's literally us saying we've been blamed. And what we're now finding is the very thing Kelly Hoffman found, right? Kelly Hoffman found that people were holding anti-Black and racist views. And that's what was more harmful. So on that note, I'd like to leave us, right? We're all women of Sigma Gamma Rho. We're all members of Sigma Gamma Rho. And we have a charge, not just from our founders, but from our mission, right? To be a beacon of light. We have a charge to go out and to educate, to be of service. And so what that means is advocating for those who might not know how to best advocate for themselves, but also entering into reciprocal relationships where we are of service. So thank you so much for your time. I know I'm looking at the chats that there was some technical difficulties. I hope I haven't gone over, but I welcome your questions and your comments. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper Owens, for all of that information. It was amazing. Some of it was us talking about technical stuff, and some of it was just us. As a person that has given birth, some of that stuff you showed, I don't want to ever have to experience that personally as a woman. But I wanted us to have the opportunity to do some Q&A and answer some questions to try to connect the historical context of how they've used our bodies to experiment in different ways to the reversal of Roe v. Wade and how that negatively impacts women of color, especially different than it does other communities. So we were fortunate for Project Cradle Care. Our charter member of our chapter, Soror Sandra Bland, is one of the producers for the documentary Birthing Justice, which is what we focused on in January. So this kind of ties into what you are talking about today. And we talked about just what it looks like to give birth in different places across the country. But now that we have the removal or the reversal of Roe v. Wade and how that directly impacts services for lower income people, the ability to get the things that they need for reproductive health, checkups, the ability to safely deliver, etc. How do we connect historically what has been done against our bodies to the reversal of Roe v. Wade?
Yeah, that's great. A great question. And it's something that I often share, I've been sharing with a few audiences. So this is the thing, right? The reversal of Roe v. Wade happens because this is where Black women, birthing people, become very important. So for anybody who followed the court case, what happens is a decision that the Secretary of Health in Mississippi decides to sue the Jackson Women's Health Clinic. Now, if anybody has been in Jackson, Mississippi, I used to teach at Ole Miss. Jackson, Mississippi is Black. Remember, I said it's the most populous Black state in the nation. Jackson, Mississippi is so Black, it's had a Black mayor for as long as I can remember, right? The current mayor, we all call him Lil Chokwe Lumumba, right? Lil Chokwe, because his dad was the mayor before him. Lil Chokwe, has been mayor now for 2 terms. So it's super Black. What happens is this one clinic that serviced the community there, which i.e. reads as a Black community. Also, we know Mississippi has remained a poor state. So a poor Black women's community. The Secretary of the Public Health, or Secretary of Health of Mississippi decides they're going to sue. Because on occasion, this clinic provides abortion services. And this is the thing, in order to even get an abortion, one has to live within a 25 or 30 mile radius. The reason this happens, and this is where I am connected to this. When I taught at Ole Miss, I had been doing reproductive justice work for a really long time. I was brought in through Planned Parenthood. I served on the Southeast Regional Board there. So we were told to go to the town, to a town hall meeting in Tupelo, Mississippi, and speak on this. What we didn't know was the Secretary of Health essentially had spies there. And there was an anti-abortion group from Colorado, well-funded. So every person who stood up on behalf of a woman's right to bodily autonomy and to determining her own, future with what happens with her child, we were all recorded and put on a video. And what we were talking about was the Personhood Amendment. Amazingly, in 2011, the Personhood Amendment was not passed in Mississippi. So I remember I was doxxed and trolled and all of those things. The police had to get involved. But, once they lost, they scrubbed it. You can't even find it on the internet now, right? I can't find it, that it even existed. So we think, yes, this is a victory for the state. No. That Secretary of State, the same person who sent spies in and wrote all our names down, had us on that video, he then says, don't worry, we'll galvanize. And with then Governor Phil Bryant. And let me just tell y'all, for those of you all who don't know who he is, Phil Bryant is the nephew of the man, Roy Bryant, and his brother who murdered Emmett Till. So that anti-blackness and hatred runs deep. He was the governor then of Mississippi when I was living there. They get together and they say, don't worry, we'll get him. They file suit. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. So it is Black women's lives in uteri that literally sparks this reversal for Roe v. Wade. And guess what? When we talk about these things, all of a sudden the Black women have been left out of the story. And is literally Black women's historic organizations like this, like Sigma Gamma Rho, like those activists I named in my presentation, that are the ones that say, wait, let's roll back the tape. Because it's really the point of origin here is the ways that Black women's rights have been trampled on. And historically, there's only been a very short window where Black women have ever had bodily autonomy. And here we were, the group that literally these really racist men, right? They come from family dynasties of anti-Blackness, have decided that they don't want to extend living wages to Black people in Mississippi. I mean, I could go on and on, but now you decide they don't even have the rights to own their bodies anymore and make decisions that they should be able to make as people who pay taxes and who are citizens in this country. No matter where you fall, right, on the political spectrum, it is it should be a constitutional right that citizens get to decide these things, especially when a state doesn't even provide full access to quality medical care in the state, because you've closed all of the Black hospitals that you created because of Jim Crow. Like, make it make sense. Make it make sense. So that's been the actual fallout that has happened.
And I kind of think that we try to make this a pro-life issue, and this is just my personal perspective. I don't really think that that's really what this is about, because if it really was about the life, then the social services and the different things that these families need once the children get here would be a priority. Quality health care, making sure that they can feed their children, making sure that the schools are top notch, making sure that they live in environments that are conducive to the life actually thriving. So it's really more so about having a control over whether or not a woman can choose to give birth to a baby or not, and dictating that for them.
Right.
So knowing what it is, all right, and it's not about a political issue, whatever side of the aisle you're on, what are some things that we can actually do to start to fight back and try to invoke change in the local areas? Because it probably looks like this is going to end up being a state by state fight, right, as opposed to a federal fight.
Education. I tell my students all the time, you are the lucky ones. I mean, all of us who are members of this organization, we're quite privileged in this way, right? Most Americans don't have college education or degrees. And so for me, it's really important to speak outside of the classroom. It's really important for me to be able to provide resources for my students, because I don't teach history students anymore. I'm teaching people who want to be doctors, who want to be nurses, who want to be dentists, who want to, they want to work in the medical industrial complex. They want to work in that industry. And so for me, it's about how can I help them on the ground to make ethical and moral choices that honors the lives and the humanity of their patients, right? And so with that, I'm saying, if you run into these kinds of practices, the anti-Black practices, or the misogynistic practices, the elitist practices based on classism or xenophobia, or, fill in the blank, right? Against trans people or gay people, whatever it is. What can we do to honor their humanity? I don't care if you like a person or not. Nobody's asking you to like somebody's lifestyle. People going to come in and be assholes, right? They're going to be mean because they're in pain, they're sick. But how do you honor their humanity, right? How do you ensure that they receive quality care? So for me, from my standpoint, it's education. Some people, it's activism. But education for me means consulting with the organizations, right? American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the National Medical Association, the American Medical Association. I mean, I do so much consulting work. I speak to community groups. Don't get me wrong, I got an agent. Y'all didn't speak to her, right? Because this is my sorority. But when it's not Black women, my agent is out here getting me to hospital organizations and insurance companies and those kinds of places, because I'm providing learning modules. We're doing all of those kinds of things. I've spoken to Congress in terms of their fact-finding missions for a post-COVID bill that should have a component that deals with the Black maternal health crisis. So those are some things you can do. The other things are, getting, I think, partnering with people, educating people about simple things like an app. Like I said, Earth, I always try to give people resources that exist today. I tell people about patient advocates and navigators. Some folk just are not comfortable questioning authority or talking to doctors and nurses. There is a website for national patient advocates. Some people call them navigators. You can go to that website and you can get someone to advocate for you, especially in the days of telemedicine. All you need is a phone. They don't even have to FaceTime. They can just listen in. You can let the doctor know, doctor, I have my patient advocate on the phone, my patient navigator on the phone. So they're going to be listening in, right? It's almost like having a doula for you, a full spectrum doula in some ways, right? For people who aren't pregnant. So those are the ways that, for me, it's how do you educate people about the process that they feel that they have more power to speak up, or at least have someone who's on their side to advocate for them.
Okay, Soror Walker had a question.
Oh, this is due to just complaints from women even today who are insured and just do this, regularly. Why hasn't the design of the speculum changed in over 100 or so years?
That is a great question, because we don't need to be having the kind of vaginal examinations that we have. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, you can go on their website. So it's ACOG, ACOG, and just put in ACOG speculum.
Okay.
So number one, most women don't need as many vaginal examinations. For many of the things that we're getting vaginal examinations for with the use of the speculum, you don't need. So for instance, birth control. Why do you need a vaginal examination for birth control?
Right.
It doesn't make sense. So people are just relying on these old, outdated practices, and there's no real need for it, right? For most healthy women of a certain age, kind of span, once you've had about 2 or 3 years of healthy cervical, and you don't have a family history of it, you don't typically need a vaginal examination every year. Now, the design is changing, but this is the thing. Most physicians claim they're much more comfortable with the metal, that the metal that makes all, you have to unscrew it, it pinches. There are investment firms coming out of Northern California, out of Silicon Valley, where they're using like soft, what's the kind of it's not that hard plastic, but that kind of soft
fiberglass.
It's not fiberglass. It's like, the plastic that sometimes you can use like for your phone covers. I can't remember. It's on the tip of my tongue. I'm having a middle age.
It's okay.
So it's like a very soft. You should be able to run it underwater, rub it in your hands. It takes on your body temperature. It doesn't have all that clanging and the screws. But and it also it has a flashlight feature, so that the
yes.
Look, silicone. Thank you. That's what I'm talking. Silicone. Thank you. I was having
yes. Silicone. Oh, okay. Silicone. Silicone.
Yeah.
Silicone. Yeah.
And so there are these women-led investment firms that are doing this, and and we'll see if it takes. It's just been a hard sell because people are kind of used to the older models because they know how to use them and they're ubiquitous. But yeah, I mean, people are doing their best to try to change the design. But the design hasn't changed. This is the thing. Not for 100 years. If you look, just Google like Greco-Roman speculum designs. It's pretty similar to what was
Much the
used
same.
millennia ago.
Wow.
Yeah. And these are not instruments that have been designed by women. That's
Of course
the other.
not. No.
Yeah.
And I'm bringing this up because um, a lot of us, the first time we went to a gynecologist was to get birth control. We have been menstruating for years, although medical professionals are saying that girls should actually go to the gynecologist as after the first menses. And sometimes that's 10 or 11. But there's so much anxiety involved because of that very invasive type of
Yeah.
exam. Like I
Yes.
wasn't briefed at all. I just saw pictures. And I think maybe that could be part of our advocacy to
Yeah.
educate, mothers like, look, you know, we're going to make the gynecologist, OBGYN, a good, safe, comfortable experience for you. It's just about overall health. It's not a sign that you want to be sexually active. You're already sexually active. You want to be sexually active. That was another thing. Like I would ask, well, why do you want to go to the lady doctor? You like, no, I just felt, maybe I just need to be looked at. But that's
Yeah.
what I was thinking as well. We just don't have it.
I'm a historical consultant with a group called ADYN, ADYN, and Emily Russo is Elizabeth Russo. I'm sorry, Elizabeth Russo is the founder. She's a geneticist. She has a PhD from Duke, and she was really bothered by the invasive nature of these kinds of procedures. So she created a company with investors out of Silicon Valley to have the nation's first birth control that's based on your own DNA. So literally, it's just like an ancestry test. You spit, it's sent to the lab, and they say, "Hey, wait, you shouldn't have this birth control because you have a family history of clots, and this causes clots." So most birth control now is given by male doctors who literally just say, "Oh, here, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?" And so and so what she's saying is, why don't people get birth control that fits your own DNA, because it can be safer? And yes, someone made, for clarification, yes, it's, even if you're sexually active, it's not necessary to get annual exams depending upon your age. Now, of course, if you're having, multiple partners and there might not be protected sex and those kinds of things, medical providers would encourage you to do so because we don't know everything about our partners and those kinds of things. But, for the kinds of like cervical cancers and those kinds of things, the annual exams are not necessary in the ways that they used to be. And the vaginal examinations are far too relied upon, just like the C-sections.
Thank you so much. We try to keep this event within 90 minutes, and I think we did really good with the amount of information that was given and even the Q&A. Definitely want to thank again Soror Doctor Deirdre Cooper Owens for sharing with her expertise, but her lifelong work, her passion, her purpose that she really is here for with us. And you can reach out to us for further information. Can you share with them your contact information, how they can get in contact with you?
Or I will actually put that in the private chat, and maybe you all can. It's historian at my name, Deirdre Cooper Owens.com. And so,
all right. And so we will share that so that you guys can have that, and reach out to her if you have further questions. We did share one resource that does have some frequently asked questions perspective, reproductive justice. This is the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. They go through some of the frequently asked questions. They go through the history of what happened with the decision, and then they talk about the necessity of having the ability to have access to abortion, how that impacts in a positive aspect quality of life for Black and Brown people and low income people.
Yes.
So this is another resource just to get some questions. I also advise that depending on what state you live in, that you get familiar with what the policies are in your state, because from state to state, it is very different. There are some that completely ban it outright. There are some that have partial banning. I think there's 15 states that found a way to codify it. The actual ability for you to get an actual abortion is codified in the law of that state. But I would look to see what the options are if you're ever in a situation, or you know someone that is in a situation where they need abortion services for whatever reason. They know where they can go, what options are available to them. And so I want to give an opportunity for Basilisk Walker to give any final remarks before we close out for this evening.
Once again, I'd just like to thank Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens for her time. So she's very, very, very busy. She gives this talk many, many times during the year. So for her to, have the time to spend with us speaking about this incredibly important issue, it just shows she does this out of love, and it shows. And thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Dr. Brown for, of course, the logistics of this, putting all this together. Just want to, for bragging rights, I do believe that our chapter is the only chapter that does the Sandra Bland event here. So, our tip does. But thanks to our audience for signing in. We hope that, you walked away with, a different perspective. Once again, when we're just starting the conversation now, and we hopefully will take this information and bring it to others and advance our advocacy. So once again, thank you for attending, and good night.